لا تخافن إلا ذنبك. If you're going to be afraid of something, then you should be very afraid of your own transgressions, your own sins. A few weeks ago, some time ago, when I was last here, I presented a new topic. And I just want to pick up where we left off there. And we said that we are told that if we fear Allah, then that will allow us to develop spiritually. The verse in the Quran says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وأما من خاف مقام ربه ونهى النفس عن الهوى فإن الجنة هي المأوى. He who fears the position of his Lord and admonishes his soul, his self, and prevents it from committing acts of sin in accordance with desire, then surely paradise is the final abode. It's the final destination. So, we mentioned that there are multiple kinds of fear, if you remember. We said that there is the kind of fear that the Quran and generally, more broadly in the Arabic language, we refer to as khashya. And khashya is translated as fear, but khashya is different from khawf. Khawf is different from wajal. All of these have different meanings and different connotations, and we discussed that last time. But again, picking up from where we left off, we have three types of fear. I'm just summing it all up. Again, vis-a-vis Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, three kinds of fear. The first is the type of fear that you experience that happens merely by being in the presence of someone who is lofty, someone who is strong, someone who's powerful. And I mentioned examples of standing in front of a police officer, an immigration officer, right? The tax man, when he comes to audit your accounts, a judge when you're in court. Because of the position that these people hold, because of the power that they yield, then merely being in their presence makes your heart palpitations faster. Your heart races. You start to stutter. You're unable to collect your thoughts and speak in a coherent manner. You start to tremble and make mistakes. You shake and shiver. All these things happen. Why? Because simply by being in the presence of these individuals who hold a lofty position, that automatically makes you fear them. Not because you've made a mistake, not because you've committed a sin, not because you've disobeyed that person. Simply being in the presence of a police officer scares many children. Is it because they've committed a crime? Because they've been caught speeding? No. But a police officer is one who holds great power such that makes you anxious when you're in their presence. Because a police officer has a gun, or a police officer can arrest you, right? But there is a level of fear that happens even before you think about the power of this individual. This is what Arabs call khashya. To have khashya is to feel anxious, nervous, simply for being in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you hear in traditions and in history that the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as the family of the Prophet, his successors, the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, when you are told that they would tremble whenever they stood for prayer. When you hear stories that when Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam or Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam was presented with water with which he could perform ablution, the color of his flesh would change, right? He would look pale, which again is a sign of being fearful. That pale color, that transition happens because of that fear. Or that when the Imam stood up to pray, تَرْتَعِدُ فَرَائِصُهُ, his feet, his body, the tips of his fingers would start to tremble. All of these things that you hear are based on that first kind of fear, on the khashya that we talked about, which is to be in a state of utter nervousness, that I am in the presence of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. So that's the first kind. The second kind is the kind of fear that you have not because you've made a mistake, not because you have committed a sin, but rather because you have internalized the majesty and the grandeur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Listen carefully, bear with me a little bit. Because you have you've gotten to know Allah, you're afraid of not fulfilling His right. First kind of fear is nervousness that you can't explain. It happens as a result of being in the presence of an all-powerful being. The second kind of fear is you being terrified of the prospect of not fulfilling the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. عدم تأدية حقه ta'ala, as we say in Arabic. That makes you terrified even more. Again, you haven't made a mistake. You haven't committed a sin. You haven't violated the sanctity of Allah. But you're still afraid that you're too inadequate to fulfill His right, to do as you're supposed to in His presence, to treat Him with the kind of treatment that befits the majesty and glory of Allah. You recognize Jabarut-illah. You recognize Malakut-illah. You recognize these grand names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His attributes, and that makes you terrified.